So the network was a response to the sort of 2021, the second year of COVID. Must have been the fourth lockdown by that point. But basically, a bunch of people in the first year of COVID had also done similar food relief. But in that year, I was working more directly with the government of Delhi. So in the second year, I wasn't. And when we saw the Delta wave sort of pick up, we realized we would have to do similar kinds of large-scale relief work. And there was a really strong sense among many of us who knew each other already from civil society space, movement space. I mean, I think that's one of the things that it has stayed with me, that it was actually a set of people who had familiarity with each other from previous campaigns, previous movements, from being in the same city, etc. So at that point, actually a round of conversation started among a small group of people saying that we have to do it more at scale this time. We have to do the relief better this time. And our notion of better was particular. It was to do it at a larger scale. It was to consolidate resources. We were also really afraid that in Delta, the notion of food relief would get even more complicated, because in the first wave, it already felt very difficult to ask people to put themselves at risk in order to go out and do relief. In Delta, it felt that much harder to do, I think, because of how high the mortality rates during that wave were. So I think that everyone felt like they needed to do this together. I think there was that sense. So the network came together actually when 5-6 folks got together and basically invited everyone who'd been involved in different ways in 2021 to say, look, let's do this together as a network. And we got on a WhatsApp group and just called a public meeting and said, bring everyone that you know. And the network was born in that first meeting. I think that things happened very quickly at that point. So there isn't sort of an easy story of how it happened. So my memory of it is this quick set of phone calls with everyone wondering what to do and saying, let's call this meeting. So I was one of the people who called that first meeting. And then as the network went on, I became part of a small core group who oversaw its functioning. So we would be the one setting the meeting and calling it. I coordinated with Shekhar, who was the one then with whom we discussed. The network was run on a single large philanthropic grant that paid for the food. And that was also a core thing about our efficiency, is that we had a single source of large funding, which enabled us to get the reach. And it was a little bit of a sort of virtuous circle, because we got the single source of large funding because we were a large network. And because we were a large network, we needed that single source of funding to help the coordination. So I was part of getting that funding and part of the people who called for the network to come together. So the network was basically, there were 3 or 4 types of members. There were one set of people who were, I think of them as spatially based organizations that work in neighborhoods and vulnerable communities and have spatial footprints in those vulnerable communities. Many of them would self-identify as civil society actors or non-government organizations or non-profits variously. There were unions and federations of workers, and these were membership-based organizations. So folks like Seva, that themselves had large sectors, large numbers of members that identified as workers, and they were spatially segregated and spread out all over the city. They weren't concentrated in a neighborhood. The third was sector-based federations like waste picker federations and waste picker unions. So single sector, large membership. And there they sort of had the membership and the spatiality overlap, because a lot of waste pickers tend to live together because they need to aggregate common infrastructure for working, sorting and recycling. So in that way, they were sort of, worker organizations, membership-based organizations, NGOs, civil society networks, both folks that worked on a neighborhood level or worked with particular communities. And then as it went on, it kept growing and joining, and I think then groups joined that came representing socioeconomic identity groups. There were groups that work with women, groups that work with particular caste groups, worked with particular religious groups. So at the end, it became kind of a mix of identity, work, space, like these 3 clusters, but basically folks who worked in Delhi somewhere in that space. There were two things. I think one is that this was a set of people who that initial conversation had experience in food relief in 21. So I think there was a sense that we know how to do this, so that we had some knowledge to already start. The other thing was that the government food aid was not as strong in 2022 as it was in 2021. So actually in 2021, you could think of the mutual aid space as a sort of gap filler, a last mile connection that sort of took what the government wasn't covering. In 22, there was no large government aid program at that point. So there was a need. It was not nearly as equivalent as it was in 21. There was some government work still going, but not nearly at the scale of the previous year. And so there was a very strong need that food would very quickly become a problem at scale. And there was a necessity for that to happen. And I think that the other thing was that I do think that by 2022, some of the state response on the medical questions had gotten better. So there were the temporary hospitals set up, all of which had been scrambling in 21. 22 was a little bit clearer. So I think that there was a sense in the network that we were best positioned to do the food relief. Individual members of the network in other capacities were also doing medical work, were also intervening in other ways. So I think that's also important to realize that the network was an issue-based network. It came together to do this one particular thing for a particular time. And so I think the idea was not to sort of say food was somehow more or less important, but it was what we knew how to do, it was what we picked, and I think that's what became the focus of it. So I think one of the things that's really important is that there is generally a sense to see a lot of social protection as largely state-driven, with the question of non-state actors or non-governmental actors doing a kind of last mile or gap-filling kind of delivery. So I think one of the things that COVID really taught us was that that's not necessarily true. That it's important to think of non-state. If you look at not just the sort of the numbers, right? 75,000 households reached in 2 months is a large scale of effort. But this is the effort that happened when the network worked entirely on its own. It's not even what could have happened had there been a certain set of enabling conditions with government, had there been more coordination with district magistrates and government officials, right? Had the resource supply been more public from the food warehouses than by private donors. So 75,000 is sort of a number that you start with in terms of capacity. The other thing that was really important is that if you take a map of Delhi and put all of these out, you'll see that there's a geographic distribution that very much resembles the way a public actor would work. It's equitable, it's spread, it's not confined to particular district. A lot of non-state actors, people say, but NGOs work with their own places, their own communities, right? This notion that there is a kind of narrowness to the targeting that happens. I think relief has shown us both things. One is that the scale at which the non-state actors can work is a meso-level scale. It will never compete with the state. It should not compete with the state. And I think it's important to also say that non-state actors are people who are 99% of the time advocating for state to be the largest supplier of social protection. That's what public function is. But the question is to say that the way that social protection is delivered will require non-state actors because of the scale of the problem, and that they can act not as last mile gap fillers, but actually as meso-scale actors that can be held accountable, that can distribute evenly across large geographies, that can think about universal deliveries rather than my members, my community, my neighborhood, my turf, etc. But it's also taught us that to do that, a particular governance form needs to be structured. And the network was that form for us during this COVID. So there's two challenges here. One is to sort of believe that non-state actors can act at meso scale as partners in a social protection delivery infrastructure. But there's also the need for non-state actors to organize themselves at that scale in forms of networks and federations. Some of them already are. So when you take a waste pickers union that has 10,000 members, they're already meso-scale actors, right? So I think there's a lot of promise in thinking about non-state actors as partnerships in social infrastructures. And I think there's also a lot of work that both sides would have to do to get there. So if you think of the metaphor of patchwork, right? I mean, what is it? So it's like a net, and you've got some parts that are strong and some parts that are weak. The trick with the patchwork is that it's not a torn piece of fabric. It holds together in some way. So when a fabric tears from the middle, you have an obvious logic in the direction of how to repair it, right? You see it, you sew it together and you put it together. When a fabric neither fully tears but not fully holds, the logic of repair is harder. And when you think of a patchwork quilt, it is not clear whether you're meant to repair it from its edges, whether you're meant to take particular patches, whether you're meant to reinforce parts of it, whether you're meant to, what in Urdu we would say, whether you do rafu or whether you do marammat, right? There are different logics of repair. I think that this is what confounds a lot of our ability to improve our social protection systems, is that we're trying to expand them and repair them. It's like repairing a ship which is sinking while you're in it and trying to make passage, right? So I think what non-state actors have the ability to do is that they have the ability to fix patchwork from within. That they have the ability to sort of, from particular locations, build up and strengthen the fabric from within, even if all of its structural faults cannot be solved by them. Even if the vulnerability still remains, it can strengthen those particular places at scale, which you need in order to build a foundation for that system to then do more, right? So I think a lot of what the non-state actors are really good at is that if enabled as partners with the state, they can show us the kind of incremental repair of our broken social protection systems that I think is critical in how we begin to repair them. Because we're not going to go from a broken social protection system that saw migrants walking in hundreds in highways out of cities to suddenly a universal protection with coverage that's adequate and quality. It's not going to happen like that. So what is the way actually with all the constraints of resources, with all the complexities of our cities? To me, patchwork is a realistic way of improving our system incrementally. And the question of who does that repair, one of the answers has to be to look beyond this state-market dichotomy to actors that are embedded, that are organizations, that are worker organizations, that are federations, and to think about how they're already beginning to repair this patchwork from within. So that's my sense of it. I think it would be very difficult for the question of sort of crisis relief to reach that scale of social protection. Transformative social protection is the notion that you don't just build a safety net, you build like a trampoline, right? You build something that enables someone to get to the next level of development. I think that what the network showed us was what elements of that transformative net would look like, right? That you bring together support for someone's work and someone's basic needs and someone's housing, right? The fact that in that network there were people who worked differently on housing and on wage entitlements and on domestic violence, on social integration, on discrimination on the basis of caste and religion and gender. I think the fact of that network shows all the elements you need to really think of social protection as transformative. I think the network, when thinking of relief, is not able to reach that kind of transformation. So I think what relief-based networks teach us is what protective social protection looks like, where you basically say, look, the ground beneath your feet must not fall asunder. But I think what it's also telling us, right, is that unless we think of social protection post-crisis or pre-crisis, not just as the bare minimum, but as something that builds a stronger foundation for people, every time a pandemic-like crisis hits, you're going to reverse a generation of social and economic mobility. So effectively what it's telling us is that if we think of safety nets pre-crisis, or if you think of safety nets as your core outcome, everyone is basically proximate to vulnerability, even if they're not vulnerable at that moment. And we live in a world where between climate change and our current political economy of development and inequality, where a large part of the world lives in very close intimacy to a crisis. And it doesn't have to be a pandemic. In India, a wedding, a death, an injury, an illness, an eviction, a demolition, a bad monsoon, a drought, a broken borewell, all of these are crisis enough for households to push them into destitution. Right? So I think what's very important for us to realize is that if we think that the network was responding to COVID because the pandemic is a kind of crisis that's unprecedented, I think the thing that the lesson it gives us is that actually that network could work in any time in an Indian city and there would be enough crises for it to respond to, right? COVID did not cause the crisis of our social protection. It just made it evident. And so if you think of crisis as an everyday phenomenon, if you think of it as a deeply banal phenomenon, then it means that your vulnerability is structural. It's not about a moment of shock. And if vulnerability is structural, then the foundation has to be rebuilt. And that can only be done by thinking of social protection beyond this base destitution prevention net. You have to think of social protection that can withstand a certain amount of everyday crisis that is going to come. No, I mean, many of us who were in the network, we talked a lot about why it had taken us so long to get together. I will say this is not the only time a diverse set of non-state actors has come together in Delhi. We've done it in periods of communal violence. It also happened in the violence that had preceded COVID in the Northeast, in the city. It has happened before. It certainly is capital D disaster linked. And I think that there's a lot of reflection that non-state actors have to do about why these forms of collaboration, sustained collaboration, seem to elude us in some ways. They do happen in certain ways. And I do think this network also came together because the seeds of that solidarity and collaboration exist. If it takes 5 phone calls by 5 people to make a network happen, then those seeds of collaboration are already there, right? But there is also a way in which non-state actors work, right? Demands of everyday life, demands of funding into the sector, demands of their own membership and constituencies. We've been part of other networks of non-state actors that are working, say, on inclusion in the Delhi Master Plan. Even there, it took us a year to convince all different actors that they had a stake in an issue that didn't look exactly like their issue. Right, to convince domestic worker unions that the city master plan has something to do with domestic work or has something to do with the rights of all workers, if not specifically domestic work. These are not easy. So I think that in a lot of ways, the counter to networks is the notion that your battles are best fought when they are specific and when your attention is only on one issue. And all movements of social change struggle with this, right? Because there is the desire to link all issues, and I think it's an appreciable desire, but there is also the real need sometimes to focus on yours, to hold on to a certain autonomy, a certain specificity. I think both anti-caste movements and the women's movement have always sort of had moments where they're saying, well, right now this is about us, right? And it needs to be, that autonomy needs to be before that solidarity and intersectionality can hold. I completely understand where that comes from. So I think there are many reasons, but I think that it's important to think very specifically about what is it that brings you together. I don't think, and this is for me the biggest learning personally from the network, I think very often it is not clear what you are calling people together to do. The advantage of the network during COVID is that there was a specific operational purpose for the network, which was the coordinated delivery of emergency food relief at scale. Right, which was to reach as many people as possible in very hard logistical conditions. I think that what this has taught me is that when networks are brought together, not only for a set of claims or analysis or work or solidarity or campaigning, but for the specific operational delivery, say, of social protection, I think networks are best suited to that. Because everyone in the network knew that without the network, we could not deliver like this at scale. Right? And so I think maybe one of the things we have to do is to also not try and make a network of everything, but ask what is it that networks are the best governance form for. And I think there, the delivery of social protection is absolutely a good answer to that question. And maybe that's the clearest lesson that we have to take from why this network came together so easily when the same people have not collaborated before, is because it was the right thing to collaborate for. Absolutely. I think that, there are 3 or 4 practices that fairly immediately we should try and hold on to, right? So one, when you see that workers' unions and federations and organizations that already have large memberships of workers whose occupation actually already is a proxy for their vulnerability, right? So if you say this is a waste workers union or a union of informal women workers, then basically what you're saying is you have already created a large public that is defined by a certain vulnerability, which makes you someone who should be getting social protection, right? So you have these, in terms of beneficiary identification, you not only have a set of people, a public already defined and accessible, you also have a set of people who don't think of themselves as beneficiaries but as workers, which I think is also a key part of working with workers' organizations, right? It gets us out of a certain language around thinking of social protection and moves it towards rights as opposed to entitlements and subsidies and charity. But I think the other thing that it does is that those publics already have relationships of recognition and trust and accountability with the union itself. So there is a way in which you have a perfect institutional setup. You have an identification strategy, you have an accountability and a governance strategy, you have relationships of trust, and you have a relationship of trust with the public that is precisely the public you're trying to reach at the state, which is vulnerable workers, right? So I think that there are and this is one example of that kind of a non-state organization. Now, if I take a neighborhood-based, an organization like the Basti Suraksha Manch, right, which is a federation of volunteers spread across informal settlements and bastis across the city, it does the same thing at neighborhood that the union does for work sector. So I think that the non-state actors represent incredible possibilities of being thought of as a social infrastructure that partners with the state to do all delivery of social protection, not last mile delivery of social protection. But the thing about it is when we say they're a social infrastructure, infrastructures by definition are networked, are monitored, are supported, are regulated, are enabled, right? Infrastructures don't exist. So the social infrastructure part has to work along with the exact conditions that enable other forms of infrastructure, right? So what does the state do to give regulatory recognition, to give financial and budgetary support, to give institutional recognition and support? How does the state create the regulatory conditions of that infrastructure for it to reach its potential? But there are practices to learn from. There are already existing advantages that have emerged as we see relief work during COVID. So I think that there's a lot that non-state actors can do, even post-crisis. But the task is to take that on as something that we want to reach at scale and not just say, in the next crisis, we'll do the same network. I think that's the challenge. So I think the state, if you take that same metaphor, right, that if you think of non-state actors as a social infrastructure, then the state's job is to enable and regulate that infrastructure. So what does that look like? The first task of it is recognition. The public has to see non-state actors as delivery partners of social protection that is still publicly regulated by the state. That recognition that this is not happening by private philanthropy, but is happening as part of the design of an architecture of public social protection is important. I think that recognition itself will make a big difference. The second part then is that the state then has to find ways to reach agreements with those non-state actors where it shares data, where it both recognizes the data that non-state actors build, like membership lists and addresses and Aadhaar cards and verification, and also shares its own data with non-state actors. Now, there, of course, the reason that regulation is necessary because that data sharing requires systems of accountability, protection of privacy, protections of trust, etc. The third is to really think about the state systematically financially supporting non-state actors so that they can change their way of working as agents of delivering social protection in a way that is not susceptible to funding cycles or is not susceptible to their irregularity or their particularity, right? Because if the non-state actors partner with the state, then the principles of the delivery of social protection, being non-discriminatory, being universal, being fair, being distributed equally, all will come into play. So I think the third part really is that then non-state actors have to have reliable sources of budgetary and funding support that allows them to focus on the delivery, and some of those must be public. I think that's important. So if I think about the way the state then responds to non-state actors, it's exactly the way it would respond to other infrastructural partnerships. Systems of recognition first, systems of partnership and accountability and role definition next, and then systems of accountability after that. And I think if we did this systematically, you would basically see the state saying, look, we've got the frame of social protection, it's governed as a public system, we go this far, you take the next, and together we're basically reaching more and more of that patchwork we're trying to close, right? So the state, non-state actors can go deeper spatially than state actors in some places. It can reach spatial pockets state actors are not reaching. It can reach them quickly and at scale. It can also create a much shorter loop of complaint and grievance redressal. And I think most importantly, it can also then strengthen the sustainability of social protection systems, because claims of people receiving them get amplified through these actors, right? If a union is working with the government, it is not easy for a government then to disregard demands of workers. And I think that the sort of shrinking of a certain political distance is also a key benefit of that partnership. Yeah, I think this was a very, very interesting meeting. One of the things is that we discussed is that the network worked very well because it was specific about its purpose, about an operational delivery of food at scale. So when the lockdowns were being called off, and when the normal PDS systems had restarted, when mobility had restarted, we did meet at that point as a network and say, are we still getting large-scale demands from the communities or from member workers, etc.? Or are we at a point where we feel like we should stop? And actually, everyone went around, and I think about 40 organizations on the Google Meet call. All of us voted, and we voted actually to stop functioning at that point. And I think that was really important. I think it was very important to preserve that possibility of coming together again by not stressing the network too much. I think there's also a temptation for the network to then become a forum that then becomes a city collective that then, and then you go back to what we were saying earlier, not all forms of political advocacy and work or the function of different actors, not all of them are suited to networks. The answer to every question is not a network. I think it can feel very tempting to think that. So that's why we wanted to say, let's not now try and weigh this with something that it's not. But we all agreed to leave that WhatsApp group precisely where it is, should we need to activate it at any point of time. And I think what's striking is that almost a year and a half after, not a single person has left that group. And if you know WhatsApp groups, that's quite a thing. And there is a faith, I think, among all of us that if we needed to, one message would restart that group in a time of crisis. I think it would be worth, at some point, bringing that group together again to also think about whether it could have an operational life outside crisis. And maybe at some point we will do that. But I think that that decision to stop when the lockdowns were lifting, I think was the right one. I think it respected what the network was for. And I think knowing how to do that preserves the possibility of future solidarity and doesn't try and overburden a collective form in pushing it into something that it cannot hold. I think that a network like this requires multiple individuals inside it who have the instinctive benefit of doubt they give to each other. So I don't think it could have worked around a single person's reputation or credibility. I think the reason the network worked is no matter whether there were disagreement or not, which they always are, two things were very clear. One is that all the information in the network was accessible to anybody. How many kids were demanded by who, where they were going, everything was done on a Google Sheet that everybody could access. So at that point, you never had to ask someone and say, how much is X getting and how much is Y getting, right? Because everything was public. The logics of that were public. They were debated in the public meetings. We met every Saturday at 4 o'clock. So I think a high degree of transparency of information was the first key, because even when there aren't disagreements, when information becomes even slightly hoarded or slightly opaque, doubt creeps in. So I think that was one of the big things, is that it was every principle we did, we reached collectively, we voted on collectively. Even stopping the network was a collective decision that was taken. And the second thing, I think, in very real terms, is networks require a degree of trust. And I think that there were enough individuals in those networks that knew each other for long enough, which is why I think a network is not a form that can easily be put together, that can be moved like a best practice in a copy-paste way from place to place. You need certain routings. You need a history of organizations and movements and people in a particular city. You need them to know each other. You need them to be able to make those first phone calls to each other. You need them to extend benefit of doubt. We had those conditions. And I think that that is one of the, I don't think it's limits, I think it's the strength of the network, but it makes it a particular form of governance. It means you can't, it's like self-help groups. There was a moment in the middle where self-help groups represented the way workers came together to pool resources, and then they became a technology, like go start a SHG. I think that's a mistake. It misunderstands, it misrecognizes that form. I don't think you can go start a network. So I don't think our work here is to say, you know what? A network is a really great social infrastructure by non-state actors to deliver social protection. Let's go start 10 networks, one per city. It's not going to work like that. I think the idea, the point is that the idea has potential, but part of its potential is that a set of people have to see it for themselves and instigate it. And I think the more the idea travels, the more it can become an option for a set of embedded individuals, a set of organizations to choose that kind of solidarity with each other. But that choice is critical. Without that, you're never going to be able to sustain it.